Hey guys, great to see a few of you here. I know that it is, quite early. I myself am struggling to stay awake, and so I do have to apologise in advance that this is quite a dense topic to be looking at this early in the morning, but we'll try to get through it. This is the player in the Pentacle, or Folkloric Motifs for narrative design. So this is actually based out of 2 years of research that I've been doing at AUT up in Auckland for my PhD. And this is the first time I'm sharing it publicly with people, so you guys are the first, so fingers crossed you like it. So there will be, in the next few months, a book that I'm releasing based on all of this content that will go into it in a lot more detail. There will be more examples and things like that. But for the sake of time here, I've sort of had to cut a lot of stuff out. So if you do have any questions about anything that I come up with, feel free to chat with me afterwards or tweet me. I don't think I have my Twitter handle up there, but it's pretty easy. It's @thepunkwriter, so just tweet me on there. But yeah, so let's jump into it and see where we go. So first off, who am I? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick. I am a freelance narrative designer. I also work as a game writer, transmedia producer, creative director, and screenwriter. I am studying my PhD at AUT, where I'm exploring the connection between folklore and interactive game narrative design. I also pioneered New Zealand's first tertiary paper at AUT on narrative design, which we ran for 3 years. Unfortunately, it was cut this year because of the pandemic and everything, but it was a very popular paper, so that was exciting. I have worked on IPs such as Path of Exile, Orbis VR, Banners of Ruin, Pathfinder, Heroic, Magic Duel, and I also work as a narrative consultant for various companies, Augusto, which are like a media house up in Auckland, QED Software. I consulted with the immersive theatre show Pleasure Dome a few years back, and then most recently I've been working with the New Zealand Film Commission as a narrative design consultant, mentor sort of character. So we're going to jump right into this because there's a lot of stuff to get through, but the first part here we are calling Framing the Folkloresque. So here we go. Okay, so seeking the missing daughter of a foul-tempered baron, the witcher Geralt of Rivia finds himself trekking through a muddy forested swamp. His search has placed him in hot pursuit of a mysterious triad of entities known as the Crones of Crookback Bog. So according to the folk stories of the region, the three crones, also known as the Ladies of the Wood, will fulfill the wishes of local villagers in exchange for their children. And so when you're playing the game, you come across this quote here. I'll try to get it through it very quickly. The gods have abandoned us, the mighty of this earth care not for our fate. Only the Ladies of the Wood watch over Vilaine. In foul times when plague or famine steals our harvest, we must beg the ladies for help. If they deem fit, they will hear our pleas and knock back fortune's foul blows. This is how one begs help from the ladies. Find a child, young and innocent, and take it to Crookback Bog. Search out the lady's shrine. This is where the trail of treats begins. Set the child off on the trail, and it shall follow its sweet track and find the good ladies. The child will never want for anything ever again, for the ladies are kind and generous. Standing there before the shrine, pronounce your request, and the good ladies will hear, for they see and hear all that takes place in their demesne. If you've made the offering as it must be done, your supplication will be heard. Everyone, a few of you, I imagine, have played this game, right? Cool. So we're not talking to the completely uninitiated here. So as the player explores the bog, they discover a small orphanage hidden within the marshes, where the children are sent to when they go on their trail of treats. There they are essentially fattened up and made ready to be fed to the Ladies of the Wood. So The Witcher 3, as I'm sure many of you know, is kind of a campy D&D style fantasy RPG game, but this quest in particular feels quite powerful and resonant with folk traditions. So this is what I would call a good example of the folkloresque. The folkloresque, which we will get into in a moment, is a way of considering the usage of folklore in games or in any sort of media. And we will jump into it a little bit more, but first let's break down the different motifs of folklore that are occurring in this quest line. So number one, we have a cursed swamp. Now this is a variation of a cursed or forbidden forest, which is found in stories around the world, but primarily in the cultures of Scandinavia. Then we have abandonment in the forest. This is another common trait in folklore, seen via the villagers sending their children on the trail of treats into the bog. Swamp water is a path to the magical. So water is a regular symbol in folk literature. It signifies the passing of the hero from the realm of the living and into the realm of the dead. Then we have the three witches. Now, three witches are found in various stories around the world, particularly in Germanic lore. The motif of three witch sisters is also found throughout Europe. Then we have the trail of treats. So magic sweets are found in fairy tales and used to lure children to their doom. In Jewish folklore, we find trails that guide characters in the direction of an other world, or the world of the dead sometimes. Folk tales in India also make reference to paths that characters are forbidden to step outside of, or else they will face certain death. We also have children being eaten. Children are abducted in Icelandic lore. They are murdered in Irish and Jewish stories. Other stories see children abandoned or stolen by witches, sold or promised to fairies. And then in ancient Greece, we of course have the Lamia, a witch who is famous for devouring children. Jumping to the next one, we have the character, the Godling Johnny in The Witcher. Now, he is likely based off a Slavic creature known as that word there, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but he is a benevolent household spirit. And then we have sacrifice for the good of a community. So this is a reoccurring belief found throughout agrarian cultures or farming cultures. And essentially it's this idea that you have to give something away to your gods or to some kind of protector for the good of the harvest. A really cool example of this that I've been exploring in my own research is the history of an Italian agrarian cult known as the Benandanti. The Benandanti believed that they could leave their bodies at certain times of year and were committed by God to go into sort of like sacred fields of lavender where they would fight evil witches known as the Malandanti for the good of the harvest. So if they won, the harvest would be great. If they lost, the harvest would fail. So you'll notice that the beats that I've just outlined in The Witcher are not exact replicas of those motifs. They are rather more inspired, or they share similarities with those motifs. And this is what the folkloresque is. So I'll read you a quote here. It says, simply put, the folkloresque is popular culture's own emic perception and performance of folklore. That is, it refers to creative, often commercial products or texts, for example, films, graphic novels, or video games, that give the impression to the consumer, viewer, reader, listener, player, that they derive directly from existing folkloric traditions. In fact, however, a folklorist product is rarely based on any single vernacular item or tradition. Usually it has been consciously cobbled together from a range of folkloric elements, often mixed with newly created elements to appear as if it emerged organically from a specific source. So that's Professor Michael Dillon Foster, who is kind of like the founder of this concept of the folkloresque. So using the folkloresque imbues your story with a sense of authenticity. It allows audiences to interpret the work as being derived from something larger and steeped in history. And this will strengthen your IP, making it durable and long-lasting. And follow that up with another quote. The folkloresque is a meaningful form of popular culture because popular culture dreams of being folklore. And so lastly, we'll just look at keys to safe adaptation. Obviously, when you are adapting folklore or dealing with folklore from various cultures, there is the risk of appropriation, which we want to avoid at all costs. Using the folkloresque as a methodology does go a way to helping that. However, there are further keys to safe adaptation. And the ones I've highlighted here, always consult or work with someone who belongs to the culture you're interested in exploring. They have information you need, information you want, and information you didn't know you needed or wanted. allow them to tell their story in collaboration with you. So for example, with this, when I was doing my research into the Italian Benandanti, I actually connected up with a guy in northern Italy, just I think half an hour outside of where the Benandanti were based during around like the 1600s, and he actually mentioned to me that he grew up on stories of them from his grandmother, and so I was able to speak with him and learn from him the sort of stories that came from that folklore tradition. So the second one, be respectful to the source material. Use it as inspiration to create something new, but if you're more interested in straight up adaptation, then you need to be certain that you're treating the stories with dignity and accuracy. And then lastly, go straight to the source. Draw your inspiration directly from the people and cultural documents that are inspiring your game world, rather than adaptive texts which may or may not have done a good job in this regard. So your job is to be a professional researcher in this instance. Follow academic conventions, go and read the original pieces if they're in another language. Try and find someone that can speak that language and can help you interpret that. But those are the three keys in my mind. I'm sure there are more though as well. So moving on to part 2. So this is the esoteric origins of narrative design, which is an interesting title, but I hopefully will prove to you that narrative design has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Where we go. So during legend performance, the boundary of narrator and audience blurs, transmission taking place interactively. The conversational nature of legend, in turn, adds to the believability of the narrative and its function as a mechanism for reaffirming beliefs, since the narrative is not set off by any distancing formula. So that is a quote from Timothy Tangalini, and he is a folklorist who has written sort of extensively on this subject. So legends or folklore are a performance. The storyteller actively provokes the listener into interacting and engaging with the tale or a tale on an emotional level. They have a conversational nature. This implies a performative improvisation on behalf of the storyteller. They're essentially making a deal with the audience as they are telling the story. And that deal is something along the lines of engage with my story actively, and in return I will grant you agency in how it plays out. So they are not set off by any distancing formula. There is an equality to the telling that lends itself to interactivity and to co-creation with the audience. So to give you an example of these early forms of narrative design or interactive narrative media, we're going to look at divination engines. So divination engines are artifacts which have traditionally been used by people to foretell the future. Things like tarot cards, knuckle bones, rune stones, the I Ching, for example. These are also known as oracle texts. Sometimes you'll see those terms switched out when you're researching this sort of stuff. They're artifacts that our ancestors used to tell interactive narratives, and they relied on both human input to work and subjective interpretation to tell the story. So divination engines are essentially random storytelling generators. So we'll look at one example today. We're going to look at tarot cards. So tarot cards can be seen as a kind of low-tech cyber simulation that users construct stories, their own narratives of destiny, from the cards, even when the softwares that they plug into the hardware of the deck are not overtly literary. Readers thus shift from being consumers of text to producers in a move that corresponds to literary and hypermedia idealizations of literature and literary machines, proposed by many contemporary theoreticians. The resulting transmedia storytelling is a user-mediated play of signifiers and signifieds across modes that extend both our understanding of what literature can be and the many uses of the game tarot. So this was a quote by Dr. Paul Montford, who is the head of the Creative Writing School at AUT and my supervisor for my PhD, so I thought I'd chuck in some stuff from him there. So Mountford suggests that by randomly drawing a spread of cards in an attempt to tell the future, players are drawing from their own psyche to construct a simulated narrative from which they derive meaning. So tarot began as a completely non-mystical deck of Italian playing cards known as trionfi, and were used to play Tarocchini, a popular game during the mid-15th century across Europe. The cards did not see use as means of divination until the late 18th century, where their arcane imagery was used as a way through which to interpret future events. So there is a lot of rumors and stories that float around about where tarot came from. It came from ancient Egypt, or it was the Romani gypsies, all these sorts of stories. But the strongest evidence we have is for this origin here. So these illustrations on the cards were suggested by psychiatrist Carl Jung to be psychological images and symbols that connect us to our unconscious self. These cards, and he says, combine in a certain way, and the different combinations correspond to the playful development of mankind. They are sort of archetypal ideas of a differentiated nature. So this is put to brilliant use actually in Italo Calvino's 1973 ergodic classic, The Castle of Crossed Destinies. So this is a short novel. Struck mute by a magical forest, several characters take refuge in a castle where they each take turns telling their story through drawing different cards from different tarot decks. So using the archetypes and symbols in these decks, their tales unfold via the interpretations of the cards. Very unusual book. I would highly recommend having a look at it if this is your sort of thing. So while Divination Engines may have fallen out of popularity for most today, their influence can still be felt in the interactive random storytelling engines of today, digital and analog games. Games that make use of narrative to contextualize the way in which the user interacts with or plays with the hardware. Exploring this unusual literary genre establishes for us a historical and narratological precedent for the use of folklore in narrative design today. Whew. Okay, so we got through all the real dense academic stuff. We're now going to hop into the dense Nick stuff, which is the model that hopefully you're all here for, the player and the Pentacle. So we're going to start off with part 3, Circles and Stars, introducing the Pentacle model. So, one of the most recognizable folkloric motifs today is that of the magic circle. And the pentacle, which is often found within the circle. Sometimes it's a pentagram if you want to get really satanic, but normally pentacle. So this is thought to originate from the Zasuru, an ancient Mesopotamian ritual in which a circle is drawn from flour around a space to purify it or protect it from evil influence. The magic circle has appeared over and over again in different belief systems, all the way up to present day, obviously, with modern occult religions such as Wicca, as well as in entertainment. So you see it in film and TV and obviously video games as well. So another quote here for you. The magic circle maintains a basic function, which is to govern the boundary between the natural and the supernatural, be it in terms of acting as a protective barrier or in terms of evoking the supernatural from the safety inside the circle. And that is Eugene Thacker in The Dust of This Planet, The Horror of Philosophy, Volume 1. Very dense book. Small though. So magic circles have long been incorporated into the lexicon of game design as well, and virtual worlds. In 1938, a book by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, magic circles are explored. He says all play moves and has its being within a playground marked off beforehand, either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. Just as there are no formal differences between play and ritual, so the consecrated spot cannot be formally distinguished from the playground. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc., are all in form and function playgrounds, i.e. forbidden spots, isolated, hedged around, hallowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. Okay, so to sum up, magic circles consecrate a space. Magic circles govern the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. Magic circles create temporary worlds within the ordinary world. And magic circles can summon spirits or protect the practitioner from them. So the Pentacle of narrative design is a non-linear narrative structure for video games. While a traditional narrative structure follows a linear ascent pathway of inciting incident to rising action to climax to falling action to the denouement or epilogue, the Pentacle, however, considers the direction of story as being unpredictable. Instead of seeing the experience as linear, it blossoms outwards into multiple directions. The Pentacle also follows the rules we just established around the magic circle. It consecrates or sets apart a space for the player to engage with something beyond themselves. It governs the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. It allows for the fantastical to supersede the normal via ludo-narrative immersion. It creates a temporary world within our ordinary world, and it summons spirits, which are NPCs, enemies, bosses, etc., for the player to engage with. And so here's my little template here of the Pentacle. So you'll see within the magic circle we have story all around there. So story is kind of like the consecrated space within the circle. In this context, it is defined as the game world itself, everything that expresses the creative intentions of the developers to the players. Story also includes characters, enemies, items, plot events, etc., but also gameplay, level design, character design, sound effects, visual effects, and so on. So story is a consecrated and sacred space for the player, meaning we as developers have a responsibility to protect the player from anything that might pull them out of the game or out of the experience, or otherwise be harmful to that experience. So this includes initially, of course, ludo-narrative dissonance. This is when story contradicts gameplay or vice versa. But also predatory monetization elements. And I know this is a hot topic at the moment, but I have to say it. I have strong feelings about it. Loot boxes, pay-to-play, gambling mechanics, etc. These practices are unethical. They have a well-documented history of negatively affecting neurodiverse players or those with pre-existing addiction issues. These things will only hurt your game in the long run. Instead, I would suggest focusing on delivering a product that players can emotionally resonate with. If they can emotionally resonate with it, it will create for you an IP that is evergreen. You will have fans for life. So, now we'll move to the head of the Pentacle. Right there, we have lore. So lore is a focused approach to crafting the richness and nuance found in great story worlds like Lord of the Rings, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Skyrim, Bloodborne, Game of Thrones, and so on. It is compiled usually along with other world-building elements in what is called a story Bible, which is kind of like a big encyclopedia. I'm sure some of you guys have seen them before. They might come under different names, but you get the idea. So lore, in my mind, is made up of generalized world building, geography, languages, culture, history, religion. You can add biology, horticulture, anything and everything that your game needs to exist as a believable world where actual people live. Lore often contains content that your players may never see as well. And now this sounds counterintuitive at first, but it is the inclusion of that content that is important as a creative text for others in the development pipeline, so that they can sort of come alongside the story and create their content to work with that world. It also allows you to extend your world in the future via DLCs, sequels, as well as transmedia offshoots such as graphic novels, web series, movies, etc. Okay, so now we jump to the left arm of the Pentacle, which is what I call deep lore. So deep lore is named because of the depth it brings to a player's understanding. It is defined as collecting all the world-building elements that are crucial to understanding the plot, and ultimately the message of your game's story. It is a world-building discipline that focuses on crucial elements like character backstories, the cosmological rules of the game, structural politics of the world, etc. These elements, while not immediately affecting the flow of the plot, instead work to contextualize the plot or foreshadow things yet to come. So to give you a quick example, knowing how to speak the Elvish language Quenya from Lord of the Rings is a good example of lore. It strengthens the believability of the world, but it doesn't really have an effect on understanding the basic plot of Lord of the Rings. On the other side, the tragic backstory of Gollum is a good example of deep lore. It highlights Gollum's motivations as a character and gives us understanding around how the plot concludes. So deep lore is a form of exposition, yes, but it is exposition that players need to be able to encounter on their own terms, as if they are discovering it rather than having it drip fed to them or kind of like thrown in their face. Cool, so now we jump to the right arm. So that is narrative. So this concerns itself solely with the mode of telling, being used in the game world to convey lore, deep lore, and plot to the player. When we discuss or consider narrative, we are looking at what tools we want to use to present the information to the player. Narrative relates directly to the working parts of the game's story, so NPCs, items, enemies, text-based pickups, audio diaries, music, visual style, tone, and even level design, among other things. So you just need to ask yourself, how do all these disparate elements come together to tell a cohesive story? How do they guide the player through the deeper themes or philosophical questions that we are asking through our game world? So the left foot of the pentacle is plot. Now plot functions similarly in an interactive piece to how it does in any other narrative piece, but there is one key amendment to this. Plot is, in a game or interactive narrative, is specifically focused on the actions that the player can take to influence the sequence of events leading to a certain outcome or outcomes. So with this in mind, more traditional elements of plot can be considered as well, such as looking at your game through the lens of an action line. Has anyone heard that term before? A couple of you. Cool. Action line, which is the physical journey that the player takes through the world, and a relational line. A relational line is the emotional journey between the player, their avatar, and the most important NPC or NPCs in the game to either the player or the avatar. So both of these concepts derive from film originally, but they are applicable to games. While your game might not need both of these lines, it is still good to look at both and just sort of check that you're covering all your bases there. And then we get to the right foot, which is play. And this is perhaps the most important element to consider for a game story. Like plot, play explores the actions taken by the player as they interact with the world. The main difference here is that play focuses on allying itself with other elements of the Pentacle model. So story, lore, deep lore, narrative, plot. And it requires the narrative designer to come alongside and engage with others in the development pipeline, particularly those working on gameplay mechanics, to make sure that the story and its themes are accurately reflected in every Ludo element of the game. For example, if your story is thematically about the horrors of war, then you want your gameplay to reflect that by cultivating, say, a sense of horror in the player when they are forced to take another life. On the flip side, one of my favorite games of recent times is Wolfenstein, the reboots, and they are good fun to play, but there is some major ludonarrative dissonance there because the game is all about the horrors of war, and yet you are kind of rewarded for the more brutal deaths that you can commit against Nazis, right? And look, I'm all for killing Nazis and beating the shit out of them, but you know, the themes are not lining up there. Cool, so we've got that out of the way, and now we're going to talk about character, and this is the second part of the player and pentacle model, and it's what I call unio mystica, which means mystical union, and it comes out of this folkloric concept of two souls becoming intertwined together. So in pagan traditions across Europe, we see a reoccurring belief that the human soul is comprised of multiple elements, collectively referred to as the double or the alter ego. These elements are usually broken down into different pieces, and today we'll be looking at the Germanic tradition because that's really the only surviving one. So the Germans broke it down into the Filja, which was a female spirit that follows, protects, and guides a bloodline. It was basically taken over by Christianity eventually, and became like the guardian angel concept, but this is where it comes from originally. Then you have the Hammer. This is a physical double of a person capable of traveling great distances instantly, both on Earth and in the afterlife, and they are able to interact physically with the world around them. And then lastly we have the Huga. Now, the hygge is a kind of formless energy that animates both the person it belongs to and the harma when it needs to leave the person's body to travel. So you can kind of think of it as like the essence of what makes you you. So the concept of the double forms the basis for the second half of this model, which explores how we can create unio mystica, or mystical union, between the player and their character. Each element of the double directs this intimacy during the writing process. Included also, we're going to look at 3 other common folkloric elements that are connected to the double. They are the soul of bones, which is the belief that the eternal part of a being resides within the marrow of its bones. The shadow, a visible form of a person's soul, which went on in literary traditions to be representative of the darker part of someone's psyche, something to be overcome typically. And then lastly, the Doppelganger, a perfect physical lookalike of a person, usually seen as a bad omen or an evil twin. This tradition, like the shadow, also found a home in literary theory in the form of what we call the inverted foil. So the inverted foil is a character that is the inversion, not the opposite, and there is a difference, the inversion of the protagonist, and their inversion forces the protagonist into confrontation with their own shadow. So, video games are obviously a unique medium that places the player directly within the body of a character rather than having them observe one like you see on film or TV. Unlike other mediums, we're not trying to get the protagonist to empathize with the we're not trying to get the player to empathize with the protagonist. Rather, we're asking the player to embody the protagonist, to wear them like a glove, to be closer to them than their own skin. In the player in the Pentacle model, the player is intimately aware of the protagonist's emotional life. The player is in union with them. So, let's break it down. The player is the hygge. Union begins with the understanding that the player is union begins with understanding the player as being our hygge, the energy or essence that animates both the protagonist and their harma. The hygge is suggestive of a player's ability to involve themselves with and control multiple aspects of your story world. The content we pass out to the player is able to be explored, played with, reshaped, and then sent back to us, as well as out to other players. So this mirrors the highly interactive exchange between shamanistic storytellers and their audiences from our ancient past. Traditionally, the hygge is disembodied, but it is also what gives the body life. It can influence others over great distances and superposition itself across other dimensions. So the hygge, or player's first port of call when entering a game, is to enter or create a protagonist to role players. Understanding the difference between the player and the character they inhabit is key here, as it allows us to consider the player and the protagonist in cohabitation with each other rather than the player possessing them. So cohabitation means that the will of an authored character is not superseded entirely by the will of the player. Respecting this separation encourages the player to work alongside the protagonist to achieve their aim. The player's actions then become coloured by the personality of the character they are occupying. Through all this, we can see that the protagonist is a kind of collection of traits that need to be fed or reinforced by the player to move forward. And this results in a desire for positive engagement with the narrative themes of your game instead of fighting against them. Of course, you will always have the person that wants to burn the world down, but in general. So moving on, the player in the harma. So the hygge has the ability to sheath itself within the harma, a physical double of a person, so as to complete tasks far away, or in some cases in other worlds entirely. Likewise, the player, or the hygge, has the ability to leave the game world and superposition themselves through the harma, which is their real selves, into our post-digital world, or an other world, of pervasive communication. So we can consider the harma as being a kind of avatar constructed by the player to best reach those that exist on transmediated platforms outside the game. So things like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, blogs, even fan fiction. Through technology, players have the power to nourish and grow stories that they like, or cut back and destroy the ones that they don't. And it's important that we as developers realize this. If we compare this to audiences of folklore in the past, we can see the same thing going on, where they would choose to share and edit stories, their own folk stories, or to let them fall into insignificance. So a player can now push their likes, dislikes, and thoughts, suggestions, and demands across multiple platforms at once to potentially thousands of people at the same time. Stories that begin as small anecdotes or discussions online now have the power to balloon at a rapid speed and change the world around them. The author, the developers, we are no longer in control of the narrative. Instead, we are in conversation with the player. So the player in Pentacle model seeks to embrace this reversal of power through the act of what's called regenerative listening. And this is when we listen to what the players are telling us, and we try to understand and empathize and incorporate into future work. Cool, right. So the player and the humor, still on here. Okay, so the player's ability to occupy their hammer and project themselves across social media opens up new avenues for narrative design around the onboarding and offboarding of a game. When the player tweets a review or pauses the game to take a break, the story no longer ends. Instead, it's an opportunity to explore new avenues of immersion. Knowing that your players are eager and willing to get in the proverbial wet sand and build sandcastles with us means that we can deliberately leave parts of our game worlds vague so that they can create answers for themselves. Okay, moving on to the protagonist and their shadow. So the shadow is the true threat to success in a player and Pentacle narrative. It represents the untamed, violent nature of the protagonist and is what threatens to consume them if they do not overcome it. The shadow is a complex psychological product of living within a broken system. Your protagonist will have developed their shadow as a side effect of existing within this system, which is typically founded on tribalism and violence. While the protagonist and the player might be pitted against an evil villain in your game, the true threat to their survival is internal. The shadow's aim is to convince the protagonist to selfishly attend their own desires at the cost of the needs of others. It demands that they assert their rightness over another's and stomp out any worldviews in contradiction to their own. The shadow demands a world of black and white instead of one of diversity. Its agenda is based out of a kind of poverty mindset where it fears those outside of itself because their views might mean that its views are wrong. So when a primitive civilization grows beyond scattered isolation, it inevitably comes into conflict with itself. And the same is true with the mimetic spread of narrative. While truth remains that we are all one people, we are stronger together than we are apart, our interpretations of that truth can differ wildly, resulting in conflict between those who should be working together to face the ultimate threats of our age, things like global warming or hatred or racism or fascism, greed, sickness, those sorts of things, right? Just before we jump onto that one, a good example of how this works. Actually, you know what? I might leave that example for after this next part. Okay, so jumping to the Doppelganger. A Doppelganger is a character that exists in the game world, or a process that exists in the game world that inverts the traits of the protagonist and forces them to confront the dark side of who they are, their shadow. The protagonist must overcome and defeat their shadow or be completely consumed by it before the story is truly over. Okay, so to give an example of how this works, who here has seen the film Casablanca? Cool, a few of you have, a few of you haven't, so I will try and... It's been a while since I've seen it as well, but so in Casablanca, you have your main character, Rick, and he used to be like a freedom fighter. He used to be like this strong rebel against the Nazis, and then he lost the woman that he loved. She left him and disappeared, and that essentially devastated him, and so he went and hid in Casablanca and runs a nightclub. And then, of all the gin joints in all the world, the ex-girlfriend has to walk into his, as the dialogue says. And so suddenly he's confronted by her again, and this time she has come with her new husband. His name slips me, but the husband is the inverted foil to Rick. He is a heroic freedom fighter. He represents everything that Rick was, and he is integral to stopping the Nazis win World War II. And so Rick is, through interacting with this couple, being forced to confront his own shadow. His shadow that is, he will do anything to get the girl back, even if it means let the Nazis rule the world. But he knows that if he does that, and he can do that because she still loves him, he knows if he does that, he will lose his own soul. And so through interacting with this inverted foil of her husband, he comes to align himself with the husband's mission, and in the end sacrifices himself, kills his shadow, and allows them to move on and continue the fight against Hitler. So that's how it sort of works, right? Okay, so the Filger as an anti-shadow and the Soul of Bones. So in the Filger, if you remember the sort of guardian angel character, we see a tutelary genie, a being of light, a representation of the feminine, of destiny, of protection, mentorship, and love. In a player in Pentacle narrative, we view the Filger as the opposite to the shadow, and the Soul of Bones as the thing which keeps us motivated to persist within the game world. There can and will be overlap between these two things, so don't worry too much about that. But the Filger always points to an identity that the protagonist can become, or at least aspire towards, if they overcome their shadow. It is the Filger's job to act as a distant call to the protagonist, reminding them of their true self, encouraging them to pass through the dominion of the shadow so as to join her and grow as a character. The Soul of Bones, on the other hand, represents how the mortality of the protagonist anchors them to their quest. You ask the questions, what is stopping them from tapping out, giving up, falling off the map? The Soul of Bones is a reoccurring element in your story that forces the protagonist and the player to keep moving forward. So the Filger exists primarily for a narrative purpose, where the Soul of Bones is represented mainly through gameplay. Sometimes these two components will exist as the same thing, other times they might be entirely separate. A Filger could be a character or characters, an event or events within the plot that repeatedly drive home the narrative moral or theme of your story. For example, something like strength is found in empathy and compassion rather than the endless cycles of violence. The Soul of Bones, however, might relate to something more practical, such as saving a loved one or hunting down a powerful relic. It just needs to be explored via narratively driven gameplay. Okay, and so we are pretty much at the end of the talk now. We're going to bring it all together here. So the player, acting as a kind of Huger, steps into cohabitation with the protagonist via entering a magic circle and engaging with the story world. They center themselves within the five-pointed pentacle of narrative design. Now separate from the real world, they are consecrated and set apart. Within this circle, the player is free to engage with the story in a non-linear way, exploring lore, deep lore, or plot in whichever order they like, through the process of play. As the protagonist, they cross paths with their Doppelganger, or inverted foil, who pushes them to confront the shadow that haunts their story. The Filger, an anti-shadow and representation of who they might become, calls out across the world as a kind of echo, drawing them forward through conflicts external and internal. It is through following the Filger that they are taught the importance of collective movement. This is when they sort of come alongside all the other allies and learn how to work with each other's strengths. And they also learn the concept of the sacrifice of self, giving yourself up for something greater than just you. So they overthrow the shadow, which is itself a representation of individualism usually, and thus reach transformation as a character. Meanwhile, through a process of empathetic design, the story world actively accounts for the player's ability to sheath themselves within the Harma, an avatar or narrative process based outside the circle of play, the other world, if you will, of non-linear digital communication, social media, that sort of thing. And this allows for regenerative listening on behalf of developers and for co-authorship of the story IP. And I think that is it. So we do have, I think, how much longer do we got? 5 minutes. So I guess I can take a couple of questions. Yeah.
Before you go steal your slides,
You want to steal the slides? Yeah, sure, absolutely. Happy to send them to you. Just hit me up online and I can get them to you. Same to everyone else. I know there's a lot of content on them, so it's probably good to read them over again. Yep.
You mentioned this is like the first time sort of listening to this information. Are you releasing this into
Yeah. So this information is essentially a amalgamation of 4 core chapters from a book that I've been working on for the past year and a half. I'm hoping to have it out by the end of the year. I'm currently at that annoying spot where you're like at the end, but you don't know how to finish the book. So I'm trying to like bring it all together. But yeah, it shouldn't be too much longer. So that will be available for anyone who wants it. Anyone else? No.
On The Witcher,
Mm-hmm.
do you see games, especially in probably the past 3 or 4 years, that really seem to be tapping into some of the things that you're talking about strongly?
Yes. Obviously I can only speak to the games that I play myself, right? And I tend to have a specific style that I enjoy. Anyone who's seen me talk before has probably heard me bring up Bloodborne or Dark Souls. These games are... I use them a lot in the book to sort of explore these elements because they do such a good job of incorporating folklore from different traditions in that style. I mean, it is something that definitely happens a lot in more fantasy-driven stories, but you do find it in other stories as well. And then outside of games too, I believe the creator of the concept of the folkloresque, he first encountered it by what did he say? He was asked to speak at a conference on the anime Spirited Away and talk about like the Shintoist belief system connecting to that anime. And as he researched it, he realized there wasn't any Shintoist belief system connected to it. It appeared to be just taking bits and pieces from different systems and then putting their own spin on things. And so that's sort of where the idea came from. And then since then, a lot of people have gone on to research it and write books. So yeah, it is throughout a lot of games and a lot of other media, but particularly fantasy or like horror inspired stuff, things that lend themselves naturally to using folklore. Cool. Anyone else? Probably got time for one more, eh? Yeah. No? Cool. Well, if anyone has any questions they think of later, please feel free to contact me online. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. It pretty much consumes my life at the moment. So, yeah, cool. Hey, thanks guys for listening. I know it was early and some pretty dense content, so I appreciate that. Have a good conference.